Welcome to Accenti's Workshops to Build Community. The project is made possible through the financial support of Employment and Social Development Canada as part of the New Horizons Seniors Program. My name is Lecha Canton, founding editor-in-chief of Accenti magazine, and today's workshop is Making a Cookbook for and from Community with Cassandra Marsillo. Our workshop leader, Cassandra, is an oral historian, artist, and history teacher who focuses on collective memory, food, and folklore. And welcome, Cassandra. We're really excited to hear you, and the microphone is yours.
Thank you. I'm so excited for today. It's also been a long time since I taught online because I used to teach online during the pandemic. So this is bringing back some flashbacks. But it's nicer so far because some people actually have their camera on, and I feel like people will actually listen in this setting, unlike college students. So I'm reading the messages. We have some really varied recipes. I saw pancakes a la nonna. I'm excited. Come and get him cookies, stuffed eggplant. So I'm really excited to hear about these recipes today. If you're here, I'm assuming that, we could all agree that food is community and culture, that recipes hold memories. And something that I always say is that like all traditions, by existing in the present, they tell us not just, about who we are today, but who we were before, evoking the places, people, and emotions behind the food that we eat. So pulling from historical, autobiographical, and nonfiction writing, what we're going to do today is explore how to write recipes through storytelling. And in this workshop, we're going to write about and around recipes directly tied to our own communities, our own families, our own personal stories. So the plan, or today's ingredients, like I wrote here today, is to go through a series of 4 writing activities that are going to allow you to craft 2 different outcomes. One that you could choose to draft today during the workshop, and another one that you could choose to develop further with a bit of extra homework that I'll give you if you feel like doing it. And I encourage you to share throughout the workshop. No one is obliged or forced to share out loud, obviously, if they don't feel. But you could share by raising your hand and we'll call on you, unmute yourself, or you could write it in the chat. And when it comes time to share, I'll just read that out loud. So for now, I'm just going to introduce myself quickly because Lecha already did an introduction. For those who joined after, we're just writing in the chat while I do this introduction where you're tuning in from, what recipe or recipes you brought to the workshop, and which culture they're from. So I'm, yes, an oral historian, but I come from the kind of bigger background of public history. So what that means is that I use the methods and theories of history, but work outside an academic context. So community organizations, museums, archives, basically places and institutions that the public engages with on like a day-to-day basis. And like we mentioned, I'm also a teacher. I teach history on contract basis at a college, Dawson in Montreal. And in my art, I work mainly with embroidery, drawing, paint, and painting. And I did some digital drawings that you'll see throughout the presentation. So my work focuses on telling and listening to stories about immigration, identity, food, folklore, and particularly with an interest in Molise, which is the region that my family is from in Italy. And, I'm interested in a bunch of other things, but this is kind of the focus of what we're going to talk about today. And I came to the world of food studies while doing my thesis, which was not on food at all. But as often happens, when you're working on a long project, you get distracted by like a shiny new project. And so that's that's where this all came from, my interest in food and in Molise, generally the history and folklore of Molise. So where the idea came from that I think it's important to preface in all this before we start our first activity together is my family is involved in these two Italian associations in Montreal that come from towns in Molise. So Santa Maria del Molise and Cantalupo. And every year they each do a feast. Santa Maria, they do a feast that's pasta fagioli, which is pasta and beans, and pig's feet. And Cantalupo does a feast that is with bacala, so cod, made the traditional way with breadcrumbs and grapes and capers. It's very, very good. And this thing called ambanic, which is basically like a polenta pizza. So you bake the polenta instead of cooking it on the oven. On the stove. And then you break it up into pieces with some greens and beans, and it makes it like mushy. It doesn't sound appetizing, but it's very good. It makes it mushy again. And so over my entire life, I've been involved somehow, some way in these associations because my family have been involved in these associations. And the conversations that have been going on for the last, 30 years that I've been growing up is the youth don't want to get involved. The youth don't want to get involved. Where are the younger generations? They don't want to get involved. But what I noticed at these feasts is that everyone shows up to them. So these are by far the most popular parties that we have as associations. Before the pandemic, there were like 400 people coming to these feasts that we would do in church basements. And all the generations were there, right? So you couldn't say that the young generation, my generation, wasn't showing up. We were all there. So this all started with the question of why do people of all generations attend these events specifically? Obviously we could say, oh, they're there to eat. Italians love to eat, they're there to eat. But there's always something beyond the food itself. And that's what I was looking for. And that's where this all came from. And that's what we're going to look for today, too. So that's where this project, later called Dalla Valigia alla Tavola, a journey through Molisano culinary heritage, came from. I could share the link because I'm not going to go into all the details to save, some time for us to do our activities today. But that's where this project came from. And I started working on it in 2019 we have a federation that represents all the Molise associations here in Quebec. And we did it together with a team of first, second, and third generation Italian Canadians that have roots in Molise, so people of my generation. I started working on collecting our recipes and stories to create this oral history cookbook, and it was finally published in December 2023. So it was, a 4 or 5 year long process. And this book highlights 42 traditional recipes, plus extra basics like making different kinds of pasta doughs, broth, polenta, etc., things that are used in a lot of recipes from the community here in Montreal. And so by virtue of these recipes, the idea was that we could not only journey through these 21 different towns, but also learn about how these towns and how the food of these towns emerged, evolved, adapted with the journey here to Montreal. And so we learned about the stories and traditions beyond the plate and from both sides of the ocean. That was the idea, is to tell the story of our particular community with roots in Molise, rooted also in Montreal, and how food plays a role in that story. With the Federation, that's how I was able to connect with all these different associations and all these different individuals. At the beginning, I was like, oh, I'm going to do this project by myself, and I'll just like reach out to people, I'll do something online. But what I realized quickly is that, when you have that community liaison, you're actually able to get so many more people quickly, right, than I would have to do by myself. And so that was a network that I used just to give an idea, since we're, talking about writing about recipes through and for community, is finding those associations, finding those groups of people that represent the community. So I thankfully connected with them. They already wanted to do a cookbook, so we were like, okay, great, let's do it. And they were able to connect me with all the different associations. And then I also connected with a lot of people on social media. That's how we made our team of like first, second, third generation, younger Italian Canadians that were working on this project. We all volunteered to do it. The photographer and I met on Instagram and now we're really good friends. But it was really, I think, at a particular time, the pandemic both hindered some plans and made some things more possible. And I think it really did make possible this form of community building online that was a little more difficult before. So just to talk briefly about connecting with community. And I want to also talk a little bit about the oral history interviews before I give you the first activity for today. So the oral history interviews were all done one-on-one, usually over the phone because it was 2020. I couldn't go over, a lot of these people were elderly folks. I could not go over to their houses at that period in time. So it was either over the phone or outside, which usually oral history interviews, you do them like inside in a quiet room. You want good audio quality. So these interviews have like, speakerphone recorded audio quality. They're not the best, but it's what was able to be done at the time. And the scope of the interviews was not just to talk about the recipe, but to talk about this person's life. So I was after kind of their life experience and to talk about their families, the towns that they came from. As much as possible, I wanted the information about these towns, about this food to be rooted in, research, quote unquote, that I was getting from the individual people telling stories. Because yes, I did a lot of secondary research, but what they brought to the table was, of course, their personal connection to the place, to the people, to the food. They had, memories of the colors of the landscape and environment around them, right? The smells around them, these really like visceral memories that if they describe them to you, you could kind of embody all those five senses rather than me just describing like, oh, there's a lake and green trees. Like they really have a way of embodying the place that they come from. And it adds flavor and color also to the recipes. So the first question I always ask people when I interviewed them was, to introduce themselves and to tell me about where they come from. So you want to ask, I'll give you a little crash course in oral history too. When you start doing an oral history interview, you want to ask open questions. You want to leave space for storytelling, right? Where the person could take that prompt that you give them and go and not answer yes or no and then stop the conversation, right? So the first question I asked in the context of this interview that they knew was about food and was about recipes was, tell me a bit about where you come from. And some people spoke about their parents, some people spoke about the hometown, some people spoke about their grandparents. And then from there, you could tease in the direction that you want. If I want them to speak more about what their parents did, describe your childhood home, what was a regular day like for you, you expand from there. But you want to start with an open question for storytelling. And it's from that broad lived experience, whether they were born in Molise or born in Montreal, it didn't matter, but that broad experience of their connection to that place that then we get to the recipe. So we can't, interview people right now in this workshop. So I'm going to kind of ask you to do this to yourselves in a way, because exactly while these recipes were collected from community members, in order to capture the meaning of the recipe, you want to ask about, the other generations, the place that they're from. It's not just questions about the dish. It's about their family, immigration, their connection to the region, their connection to Montreal, the community here. What was it like growing up? How, when, why did they learn how to cook, particularly the recipes they submitted? has the recipe changed over time? That was a big question that was asked. And the interviews were anywhere between 45 minutes to 2 hours long. And that's fine. You know, sometimes I did an oral history interview that was 20 minutes. Like, it's what the person has to give. Oh, thank you, Mary. I'm reading the comment. And the family stories are really what give the depth to the recipes. So with all this in mind, we're going to start with writing from a place of autobiography, since we can't do the biographical aspect. So the questions to explore are: where does your family come from? What was your childhood like? How is food in general a part of those memories? You want to describe important details like the people, places, think of your five senses, and start broadly. You don't need to speak about the recipe or recipes that you brought here. This is the context behind those recipes. So I'll give like 5 minutes, Licha and I had said. Take your time, and then whoever feels like sharing at 12:55, we could share. You want 1 more minute or? Yeah. All right, so let's make our way back, even if we're not done. Because also, I mean, you don't need to finish the piece today. But also all the pieces, I didn't explain this at the beginning, I should have. All the pieces that we're doing come together in one final thing. So even if you're not done what you're working on now, you have a chance to think back at it in the final activity that we're going to do. Does anyone want to share what they wrote, as my neighbor has been nonstop mowing the lawn for the last hour, so I apologize for that noise. You could also, like I said, copy paste in the chat if you wish. No? No takers? Anna, go ahead.
Hi, so I'm Anna, and I actually live in Italy. I have been living in Italy for the last, well, a long time, put it that way, ever since I got married at the age of 22. My family is bicultural, so yes, more than community, I'm kind of interested in looking at mixed marriages because my dad was Italian. He immigrated to Canada way back in the 50s, 1956, and he married a Canadian who was born to British parents and who had never left Vancouver. So she was like quite naive, knew nothing at all about Italian culture, and married a man who could barely speak English and was very adamant about wanting Italian food. So my mom became gradually interested in cooking, and I just remember her always in at the Italian clubs meeting Italian women, because of course my dad had his like entourage of friends, and she would whenever she would go to a friend's house that was Italian, she would have her notebook and her pencil, and they would cook, and she would be writing down all the recipes. And this was even with my nonna and my nonna's house. She would be in the kitchen, and my nonna never had recipes. She just threw things together, that's what nonnas do. And she would be in the kitchen watching my nonna and writing everything down. So I have like all of her notes, everything, and all of those recipes have been kind of passed down. So in her cookbook, she has recipes that are Lydia's fruit cake, Angelina's fruit cake, Ushi's fruit flan. I mean, it's all names of people who have given her these recipes, and then she's mixed them up and stuff like that. a lot of times when she would come from a holiday in Italy with all these recipes, she would maybe not even be able to find all the ingredients. So there was always this mixing up ingredients or trying to find the equivalent, or trying to make it as close as possible. When I moved to Italy, I kind of wanted to replicate Canadian recipes and British recipes, and I found myself on the other side trying to find ingredients that 40 years ago I couldn't find. Now pretty much everything you can find, but in those days you couldn't. So I was always trying to put these things together. So it's a kind of a real mixture of community, of family recipes, historical recipes, all mixed together, and then also this component of a mixed marriage, which was not so easy for a lot of them, right? So that's my take on it.
You brought up so many things. You brought up so many things that I'm going to talk about.
Yeah. So yeah,
through this,
both my parents have recently passed away, and my mom wanted to do a recipe book for the family. So I'm kind of going through all of this stuff. Like she has like binders and binders and binders of recipes, and I'm kind of at a loss to where to start. And I want to do it with the stories that go behind it, because every recipe has a story that goes with it,
Yeah.
So that's kind of what I'm trying to do. Anyway. Okay, I'll leave the floor for someone else.
Thank you so much. Did anyone else want to share something? Go ahead, Liana.
I very briefly want to mention that I remember the food and the smells especially, and a lot of these foods are things that my grandparents who are still alive or my grandmothers who are still alive continue to make. But I also remember very specific things that you only retain from childhood. Like when you're a child, you spend a lot of time playing on the floor. So I remember the texture of my grandparents' rug, which they still have, and which you couldn't walk on with your shoes. And I remember how all of the men in the family would retire to like smoke in the basement or in the garage. And nobody really smokes in my family anymore. And I certainly don't smoke, and my partner doesn't smoke, but every once in a while someone will light a cigarette if we're out, or whoever, friends, and it reminds me of my grandfather and the smoking that people would do after we'd had this big meal. So I remember that very, very viscerally, beyond the fact that just my two grandmothers could make the same recipe, but because of their own variations they would smell very, very different. And you could always, like, if you walk into Zia's house or whoever, you could tell which nonna had been cooking something, because the two of them would just cook differently, so they could make the same thing, but the smells were very distinctive. Like, oh, it smells like this nonna's cooking. It smells like this nonna's cooking. So I remember that very clearly.
You just made me realize that I could smell the difference between both my nonna's tomato sauces. Like, I know which one is which. Go ahead, Christina.
I think it's so funny, Liana, that you just talked about smoking, because I also wrote about smoking, but it was sneaking out of bed, because we used to sleep over a lot at my maternal grandparents when we were kids, because they were just a few blocks away. And I was writing about remembering sneaking out of bed in the morning. I was not supposed to be up yet, and I would sneak out because Nonna was in the backyard smoking and surveying his garden, like just kind of like taking it all in and examining the various beans or whatever vegetables that were growing, and then equal measure examining all the flowers very carefully, and the entire time always with a cigarette pinched between his fingers. So and he would humor me. He wouldn't send me back to bed. And the memory of like the dew on my feet, because it was one of those dewy summer mornings. It's very nostalgic, I know, I'm sorry. But that was summer with Nonno and Nonna, and then Nonna would find me and I'd get yelled at and get sent back in. But the smoking was just it stopped eventually, because we bullied him into quitting when by the time I was like 11 or 12, all of his granddaughters were haranguing him to quit. So he did, but that still sticks more than a lot of other things.
Go ahead, Marisa.
Yeah, actually, one thing something that some of the previous interactions brought up for me is that, um, when my parents came from Italy, they went back. My father went back for one funeral, but he hadn't had a great time in Italy, so he never took us to Italy as children. And so finally, when I went back on my own cash at around 25, one of the marvelous things that happened was that, and I was actually not even in our region, was that I was in an agroturismo and had a piece of that yellow cake that I think we all know that tastes eggy and lemony and all of that. And it was amazing. It was like the same. It was that taste that was like a million miles away. And it was very similar in spirit and in taste and in look, was incredible. And that was it was a kind of an important moment for me. That I had eaten that stuff in Montreal all the time. All my aunts made it, and then just went to went to Italy and had the exact same piece of cake. So it was amazing. Yeah.
I love that story so much because that was such a big scope of the cookbook, obviously, right? Is that duality of, this dish existing here in Montreal and feeling like it's very much a part of your Montreal Italian experience. But of course, it comes from another place that not everyone has gotten to experience, with their body in person going to Molise, but they have experienced Molise in some way by eating the food here and by being in community or in family here. And I'm doing a project now actually on it, Italian birthday cake. The cake it's called Italian birthday cake here, but in Italy it's not that. It's just like a cake with the vanilla cream and the chocolate. Well, it's custard, not cream, right? And soaked usually with like strega, or I think the traditional one is the alchemies, but it's hard to find in Canada. And that is such a great example, I find, of how, something takes on this identity, the Italian birthday cake, right? Or the Italian cake. But if you ask anyone Italian, my boyfriend's Italian, and I'm like, oh yeah, Italian cake. He's like, well, what's Italian? Like, he didn't know. He was like, what do you mean? Is it cake? Like, it's not called Italian cake. It became Italian cake here, right? And so there's so much kind of storytelling happening at both ends, and it's such a tangled knot of stories, but it's so fun to weave through them. And so I'm so happy with the pan di Spagna, exactly. I'm so happy with so many of the things that people brought up, Anna Fornari as well. You talked about something that I was going to literally say right now, so I was so glad that you brought it up. That exactly, sometimes when we're thinking of these recipes and these dishes, the community is not just, community like the other Italians, but it's different aspects, different people, that idea of like of the mixed marriage, that's its own kind of, community forming, and its own kind of experience entering and existing in community. And so what I want us to look at now is, we looked inwards and at our kind of relationship with memories, with the recipes, with, childhood in general, our relationship to food and smells and sounds. But usually our relationship to food is exactly that. It's connected to other people, and it's not necessarily community, capital C, this vague thing, but it's real people. Anna, like you said, names, right? You could say who you learned this from, where you got this recipe from. You could actually identify that. And so when I ask people in the cookbook about learning to cook or making the recipes, they often shared stories and memories of, their grandparents, their aunts and uncles, their parents, their extended family. And the reality that actually they learned not the way, you know, I learn, or I'm going to use a generalization, like the way we learn today, where we say, okay, sit here next to me, take the ingredients and show me how to do it. Or that, you know, we follow a recipe already written down. They learned from years of observing, like passive observation, right? So they would see usually their moms and their grandmothers in the kitchen every day, and they watched. And so I brought a few examples of people that identified different, you know, community members, let's say, that they learned from. So there's Teresa. She makes her mom's cavatelli from a recipe that her mom made, you know, forever, for many, many years, but that she only recorded 13 years ago when her mother taught her granddaughters, right? So like Teresa's daughters, when her mother taught Teresa's daughters how to make them. Matteo makes casciatelli. I don't know if there's some of you here that know what those are. They're like a baked dough that's stuffed with usually either a savory or a sweet filling, usually with cheese, eaten around Easter. He learned that from his grandmother, but he makes his own version. He like remixed his own filling to put in these casciatelli. And now actually those are the ones that the family prefers. They ask him to make his remixed version of this traditional dish. Libera was really interesting because her recipes did not come from her family. They came from her friends that she met in factories working in Montreal. So they're traditional Italian recipes, but learned from her friends here. Who else did I put here? Giovanna learned how to make traditional dishes from her husband's hometown, which, you know, they're both in Molise, but his hometown has different recipes from her hometown, of course, right? Every town has its own traditions. And she learned from her mother-in-law. Faustina, her entire philosophy on food, on ingredients, comes from her grandfather. So it's not even just about the recipes, it's literally her philosophy on how to eat that comes from her grandfather. And so we see all these different networks emerging here. And I wanted to share something a little out of the box before I give you your next activity. And that, you know, for me, and I think for a lot of people in my generation, born and raised in Montreal, you know, even junk food, quote unquote, has meaning. I have special memories, particularly of these industrially produced cakes, like little cakes. I'll tell you what they are after, because they're linked to someone who's no longer here with us. And I also have a particular link to a fast food restaurant because of my nonna. So I want to read a little excerpt of an upcoming text that is going to be published in this magazine called Kitchen Stories as an example, where I talk about these little industrial cakes. So being Italian Canadian, growing up in St. Leonard, a suburb in the east end of Montreal, meant that half our street was occupied by paisans and distant cousins. In elementary school, if my nonni weren't in Florida going south for the winter, also called being snowbirds, as we say in Quebec, it meant that lunch was at their house down the street from ours. If they were on vacation, it meant after school at Joe's, down the street from them, where my sister Erica and I were always greeted with, "Do you want a Coke and Joe Louis?" My sister and I never really liked soft drinks, so we would pass on that, but the Joe Louis, May West, and Passion Flakies were treats that we never said no to. Though we had been spoiled with homemade Italian cakes and cookies since we were born, there was something special about these sickly sweet manufactured goodies. Both the Joe Louis and May Wests are little round cakes covered in a thin layer of chocolate and stuffed with cream fillings. May West is vanilla cake and vanilla cream. Joe Louis is chocolate cake with a marshmallow fluff. Passion Flakies were rarer, but love at first bite for me, a pastry layered with apple raspberry jelly and whipped cream. I wish they were actually as good as I remember them being, although maybe that's just the memory of Joe's care for us. At my nonnies instead, the lunch menu revolved around eggs, pastina con uovo, a soup made with savory chicken broth, small noodles, and a beaten egg, which is added the last few minutes before serving, or pane con uovo, a simple fried egg on a piece of buttered toast. Egg and then the Flintstones before heading back to the schoolyard. Some days, though, we got really lucky. Nonna Lucia loves Harvey's, a Canadian fast food joint, and when she had a craving, and Erica and I got to tag along with her for lunch. I'll tell you more about Harvey's later. But for the cookbook, at the end of every interview, I asked everyone why they continued to make these recipes. They all said, it's good, it tastes good, it's good for you, it's a tradition. But they also said throughout their interviews and throughout their reflections, what they told me was that they want to be remembered. Food is not just a way to connect to culture. It connects you, as you've all already said, with the person who has always made it for you. And that person is probably the reason why you will continue to make it or eat it, even if it's every once in a while for pure nostalgia, like Mae West. I don't eat them that often, but every once in a while I'll get a Mae West and I'll think of Joe. So talking about making traditional Christmas cookies, there was another Maria that I interviewed. She was talking about these cookies called, well, they're not really cookies. They're ostie ripiene. So it's like the host filled with a chocolatey nut filling. Maria said that it's a super time-consuming, like labor of love process. But when she's making those, she thinks about her family and she thinks about her mom who passed away and who she used to make these with. And so that moment for her is not just for making cookies, it's for thinking about her mom. And I don't think that it's limited to, who sits around the table around us, right? That cooking is an act of love. We want to share love. It's not limited to the people around us. It's an act of love also for those who have passed and those who will come. So this is what our next activity will be about now, the people behind the plate. So, maybe some of you learned to make this plate from somebody, but maybe some of you haven't. I put 2 different prompts in case. Think of the person or people you associate most with this recipe, or even your relationship to cooking more generally. Like Faustina that I mentioned before had a particular philosophy on food from her grandfather. And it could be anybody. It doesn't have to be a family member. It could be any person that you identify this dish with. When did you learn to make it? From who? Why? Describe what it was like and describe this person or people. Or if you didn't learn how to make this recipe, when did you first eat it? If you have memories of that first time, who made it? Describe what that first moment was like, and again, describe this person. So I'll give 5 minutes again. All right, time is ticking on by. So I'll ask if anyone wants to share at this point about the person or people that you associate with the recipes you brought or to your cooking in general. Linda?
So I'll share because my experience is very different from most of you. I'm a half French Canadian, half English Canadian, but I was born in Rosemount, St. Leonard. So all my friends are Italian. But still, as a child of the 60s in North America with French and English Canadian parents, it was a trend to enjoy canned fruits and vegetables and prepackaged desserts and tomato sauce. So I can't remember the first time I tasted fresh tomato sauce, but I can remember the first time I made it because my friend Maria invited us over to her mother's garage on a rainy September Saturday, where my husband and I, we quartered and squeezed tomatoes and filled the mason jars like the newbies that we were. But the following year, and every year since, I think it's going to be 10 or 12 years this year, we're getting ready to do it again in September. We gather at Maria's house, a group of friends, and we do this all day long. And at the end of the day, we make a pasta dinner, have a glass of wine, toast our efforts, and go home with our mason jars of sauce. And it's just really a fun time.
Thank you, Linda. And yeah, that's like, doing something that people associate usually with family, with kind of like the chosen family, right, of your friends.
Exactly.
And I have something for you because I'm talking about pâté chinois soon. So we're bringing in the Quebec French-Canadian element. Someone else wanted to share. I saw a hand.
Yes, this is Maria. Just to build on what Linda was saying, which I found really interesting, is that my memory is connected with my mom because when she came to Canada in the mid-50s, I was born in Montreal. Of course, she brought all of her traditions over and she would be there to prepare all the, the usual preserves and home-baked cookies and all of that. So it was really great. And so particularly, the first weekend in September was very important because it's, the harvest. So that's when you have an abundance of tomatoes and she would rally the family together and we would all produce, hundreds and hundreds of mason jars to supply the family for the whole year. But what was particular about that weekend and, with Linda, when she mentioned that at the end of it all, you kind of have your little reward. You have a glass of wine and you enjoy the, the fruits of your labor, so to speak. Our reward was that my mom would make these great stuffed eggplants. I mentioned that in my notes. And because, again, it was harvest time, you have the seedless eggplants, like they're pure white inside. They're gorgeous. And it's a recipe without meat or anything, but it was just our little reward at the end of a long day or a long weekend, actually. And it was a feast day of San Nicodemo in the town where my parents were born. So that's connected again to that kind of occasion where you, you prepared these wonderful treats. And as a family, you came together after. It was laborious. 2-3 days of a lot of fun, a lot of yelling, screaming, chaos. There was red everywhere, tomatoes. And then at the end, we'd sit down and we'd enjoy the homemade pasta that she would make, the fresh tomato sauce, and these great stuffed eggplants, which the reason I bring that up is because, for the 3/4 of my life, basically, she always prepared them. And so she would hand us these wonderful platefuls of this delicious, delicious vegetarian meal, if I can call it that. And then about 15 years ago, she said, why don't you kind of observe and look at what I'm doing? You might want to learn how to make them, which I did. I was towards the end of my career at that point. So yeah, I had time. I said, yes, let me take notes and watch her. And it was quite a ritual because she would do the sign of the cross. It was really very special. And I observed her, but she still kept on making them because she would spoil us that way. And knowing that we were all kind of working and really didn't have working outside the home and not having necessarily the time, we didn't prepare them ourselves. I started preparing them myself 2 weeks before she was called for an appointment, September 2018. And she had ordered like bushelfuls of these eggplants but didn't have the strength, and we needed to take her to the hospital. So she guided me and I prepared them and gave them to my brothers and sisters. And when she was in the hospital 3 months later, she never left the hospital. She passed away. And I had the eggplants there for my brothers and sisters, and I've been making them ever since. Yeah, in memory.
I really appreciate, Maria, the aspect of the ritual that you brought up too. I think it's, I'm thinking of when we make the tomato sauce, like the last few years, my nana is still alive, but she's been in Italy the last 2 years when we make the sauce. And my mom is so keen on like following the exact like structure and ritual that my nana follows, to the point where she was like, which direction does this table go? Is it like this or like this? And we're like, it doesn't change anything whether the table's like this or like that, but she has to do it exactly the way my nana does it. So I resonate with that so much.
Thank you.
So we'll keep going just because it's 1:30. God, time goes so fast. So now, we're kind of expanding. The next step of writing this cookbook for me, after doing the interviews and collecting these stories, was really doing more research on the recipes themselves. I always ask people, do you know the origins? Does your family ever tell you like a story about this? Or they would share if there was, Maria, you mentioned like the feast in the town, like, is there a particular feast that's it's associated to? And so they would tell that story. But keep in mind too, like, remember, this is being done at the height of the pandemic. So my original plan was to make the recipes with the people who submitted them. We couldn't go to their homes. All the interviews were done on the phone. And I kept, I don't know how many follow-up calls I did for clarifications, right? How long does it go in the oven? What's the temperature of the oven? How much salt? How much oil? How much sugar for cookies? How much flour? It just says flour. Like, how much flour do I need to put for these cookies? Can you describe the technique or how it's supposed to feel? So that was a big part of the research process, but a lot of extra research was done online through books. eBay was my friend because it's so hard to find books on Molise, and so I found like any old cookbook on Molise that I could find on eBay, and I bought it. And so that was all also a part of this kind of like ever-growing network to answer these questions. Not always for the mystery of the origins, and we'll talk about origins in a second, but sometimes, to just try to find whatever connections that I could find. So sometimes it's easy. For example, Yelsi is a town in Molise. They have a traditional dish called funatelle. It's eggs poached in tomato sauce and red peppers. If any of you have ever had shakshuka, that's what it is, right? Eggs poached in tomatoes and red peppers. And it's almost exactly the same recipe, which is, shakshuka is a North African and Middle Eastern dish. And of course, this makes so much sense. We're talking about Southern Italy. It has proximity and connection and history with the Middle Eastern and North African area. And so it's clear that there's some kind of relationship there. Sometimes I came across really like surprising discoveries. I was reading this book called Ancient Roman Cooking, and I found a connection to these cookies called mustaccioli. I don't know if anyone has had the pleasure of eating these cookies. They're, chocolate. They're made with cocoa. They have a lot of spices in them, some zest, citrus zest. And as the name suggests, are made with mustaccioli, mosto cotto, wine must. That exactly, they're delicious. It's a cooked down version of the fresh crushed grapes when you're making wine. And they have, if you had them, traditionally they have like a diamond shape that you're supposed to make them in. So as I was reading that book, I found a recipe for something called mustacce, which were in ancient Rome, these small breads made with wine must and baked onto and in the shape of bay leaves, which have kind of a like diamondy shape. So, I have no proof, but I'm like, this sounds like mustaccioli. Like maybe this is an early, iteration of what ended up becoming these Molizan cookies. But there's a few things that I want to stress today before the next writing activity. And so one is that food and its history is often co-opted for specific reasons or for other reasons. That might be, you know, for religious traditions and feasts, but it could also be for nationalism. It could also be for nation building, community building, right? And so the folklore around particular dishes that are rooted in myths, legends, and ceremonies might be different from the history that you find on that dish. That's okay, because we have a lot to learn from both of those aspects and, you know, everything in between. The second thing is that sometimes we actually can't find, actually most of the time, we actually can't find the origins of a particular dish. And we'll get back to this, because third, maybe origins don't matter as much as we think, which I'll get back to in a second. So I want to give two examples where I thought about origins in different ways. The first one is for this dish called lesata. It's in the cookbook. It's made in Frozolone, well, and other towns, but the person that gave it to me is from Frozolone. And it's traditionally prepared on January 17th, which is St. Anthony. And he's the patron saint of animals. So what would happen on that day is they would have a special mass for the town's animals. And they would bring all their animals to the church, where the priest would go outside and bless all of them. Afterwards, the people would go home, bringing obviously their livestock and whatever they had with them. And they would prepare lesata, which is literally boiled corn with salt. That's it, right? Some people added some grains to it. They would add maybe some oil, some butter. But at the end of the day, what is special about this dish is that it's supposed to be eaten only a little bit by the humans that prepare it, and the rest had to be given to the animals as an offering after. So you would prepare it, eat a little bit, and then give the rest to the animals. So you don't want to make it too complicated, right? It has to be edible for them. And so this dish is nothing special in and of itself. You know, we could today just like take a can of corn and put it in the microwave, and that's the idea of it. But the idea of origins here for me were different, right? So I learned about lesata when I interviewed Giovanni, who's from Frozolone. He immigrated to Montreal. And one thing that he said really stuck with me. While he was describing this, he said, "Eravamo amici degli animali." We were friends to the animals, or of the animals, while he was explaining how they shared this meal. And that got me thinking of, you know, most families at this point in time would have one pig for the year, unless they worked with livestock. And even in that case, you're usually selling that livestock. You're not keeping it for your family. Just with the pig, the head would be used to make gelatin. The skin and lard would be used to make, you know, the rinds, the cotche. The legs, you make your prosciutto. The innards, like the stomach, you make tripe. The ribs and the bones, you can make the bollito, right? The boiled ribs. And even the hooves, I learned, would be used to make buttons. So we know every part of the animal was used. And, you know, maybe in our perspective today, it's kind of hard to imagine the duality of like being friends with the animals and then, you know, eating every single part of this animal. It's also hard to imagine a reality where you might only have access to one pig every year, one that had to be shared between, you know, at least 4 people, and usually the families were bigger than that. And this is, you know, a story I tell and think of all the time, of my nonno who shared this memory of, you know, the lard rubbed on bread so that he could taste meat on it, even if there was not meat on the bread. Just having that taste of the last bit possible of the family pig. And all I kept thinking of was like, well, what would that pig mean to me if that was my relationship with the animal? And so, you know, a few people were like, why are you putting boiled corn in this cookbook? And for me, it was not about the boiled corn. It was about all the story behind it, right? The act of sharing the meal between you and the animal, feeding each other, right? We often talk about food as a universal connector, bringing people together, creating bonds. You know, we talk about breaking bread. When we take the narrative away from the table and now we're talking about sharing this with animals, how does that change the way we engage with life around us? This simple recipe for me is evidence of a way of life and a way of existing and engaging with the world that is mostly lost to our Italian Canadian community today because context changes, life changes, right? On a different kind of exploration of origins, more recently, I did a deep dive on the mysterious origins of a French Canadian dish called pâté chinois. I wrote about this in my newsletter. I'll share you the link of it because I'm not going to read it all now for the sake of time. But if you are interested in the mysterious origins of pâté chinois, it's a fun one to read. But basically why I wanted to talk about pâté chinois in this newsletter that talks about Italian Canadian food and experience and community in Molise is because my nonna made it so much growing up that I thought it was an Italian dish. Like I just thought it was Italian cooking because it was part of her Italian repertoire of food. Oh, thank you. And you know, we called it pâté chinois, which is French, a French term. It means Chinese pie. But growing up in Montreal, we always mixed English, French, and Italian. So it wasn't weird to me that we might refer to this in French. It was just like, this is an Italian food. We call it in French. I don't know what. So I didn't realize that we don't know where pâté chinois comes from, actually. It's called pâté chinois because there's a false story that it was named after the Chinese migrant workers who came to work on the railways in Canada, and that all they could afford to eat was pâté chinois, this dish, right? But this has been debunked by historians because, you know, it was proven that actually their diet consisted of more traditional food, rice, salmon, and beef was very rarely consumed in China at the time. So Chinese laborers would not have been using the ground beef that we use to make pâté chinois. And so anyway, it has this whole story that I'm not going to get into right now, but it was nominated as the like national dish of Quebec, but one of the panelists who was on this judging panel to choose the national dish of Quebec then followed it up by a book trying to find the origins of pâté chinois, and he realized that he like couldn't find. We don't even know if it was like made in Quebec for the first time. And so it was kind of this interesting story of this national dish that might not be, you know, from this place, but definitely has become such a part of Quebecois identity, so much so that even my very Italian nonna has learned, I don't know from who, I have to ask her, to make this dish. And we've eaten it our whole lives growing up. So going back to origins, before I give you your next prompt, it is almost like shepherd's pie, but not quite. That's also in the newsletter. To go back to origins, Massimo Montanari, I have this book right here, is an Italian scholar. It's a book about the history of spaghetti with tomato sauce. He writes about particularly Italians' obsessions with origin stories around food, because these origin stories help to build identity on the local and the national level. In the introduction of his book on the history of spaghetti, he explains that it's not actually the origins that matter, because often we cannot get to that point, but the encounters, right? And by confusing roots and origins with identity, we miss the points of encounter, and we try to fix identity in the present when it is an ever-evolving, ever-changing thing. When we're looking at, or looking for origins, the best we can do is look for moments of possibility. Which encounters could have brought this forward? which realities did this grow out of? How many other possibilities were there? I'm thinking, you know, of the funatelia and the shakshuka. That came out of the same encounters. And this way, we're able to take in all the variations, right? All of the movement and flexibility that we need to explain human existence and experience throughout history. We saw this even with the recipes submitted to the cookbook. We got many variations, for example, of pasta fagioli, pasta with beans. Many towns make this simple dish in their own way. There is no right or wrong way, and there's no way that I could ever say which was the first town to make that dish. So your next writing activity is research the origins of the recipe in the best way you can. Reminder that sometimes it's impossible to find. Sometimes there are multiple theories. You could have theories based in religion or ancient traditions. There's sometimes folklore aspects. Summarize, you know, even if you go on Wikipedia, summarize what you find. What we want to do is try to bring the historical and folkloric aspect of this recipe together. So, Maria, you could talk, for example, about the feast.
Yes.
And, you know, what kind of ties the history of this dish with that folkloric aspect.
Yes.
So, you know, time is ticking away, as I keep saying, because now I'm stressing with the time. 7 minutes because you have to research, and then we're at the conclusion. Oh, and Maria, you don't have to do that, but I'm saying there's a clear folklore aspect.
Yes. I like it.
Okay, so the mowing is still happening here. I don't know how it's possible to mow your lawn for so long, but what I think we'll do is for the last activity, I'll just give it all as homework if you want. I'll describe it and I'll leave it to you so that we have time to share. Like I'd rather hear what you're doing now, and then I'll share the prompt of the last activity, and I'll write my email in the chat. Like I would literally love to read what you write, so email it to me and I'll read it. So does anyone want to share what they learned about history and folklore of the dish or the recipe? Sure, Anna. Mayolo.
Oh, sorry about that. Hi. So, I didn't expect to like have a recipe ready for some reason, but off the top of my head, I chose something that my mother would make quite often. And now that I'm in Calabria, I see that everybody's making this. We call them vecchiarelli, but the recipe, they're zucchini fritters, or some people call them pitelli. Have you ever heard of that? No, yes.
Yes.
Okay. And it's just basically zucchini, zucchini flour, eggs, a lot of cheese, and then you kind of make a little mixture, and then you kind of drop spoonfuls and you fry them. Researching it, I mean, I really couldn't find anything in particular. Oh, you call them shurilli. Okay. But all I saw that, which makes a lot of sense because, they stretch, right? With one zucchini, you can make a ton of these fritelli or vecchiarelli, we'd call them. They're cucina povera. There's no waste for cooking sort of thing, that you could take a zucchini or some flour, the zucchini flour, and, fry up a bunch. You can eat them as an appetizer. You could eat them with bread. You could eat them, in a picnic, wherever. But that's it. That's all I could find about that in particular.
And cucina povera too is something that unites so many different cultures because, poor people, the peasants in a variety of culture had to have the same practices, right? And had to kind of eat similarly to not waste and to stretch exactly as they could.
Right. And I learned how to.
Oh,
sorry. I'm sorry. Go ahead. No, it's fine.
No, I'm done.
Give everybody a chance. Go ahead.
Leanna, you could go if you want.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, it took me a minute to realize, Anna, that I looked up the same thing, and my grandmother would also make them, and she's also from Calabria, and I that's right. People call them shurilli. I learned that today, Googling it, and my nonna would call them fiori di zucchina ripieni or just fiori di zucca, and it's all like the same thing, right? And yeah, very similar. Like it's, le persone in campagna would eat it, and I found this one sentence and it just says le origini sono del tutto sconosciute. Like nobody really knows. It's like they just sort of appeared. So I'd be curious to learn a little bit more about that. But yeah, go ahead.
Like I have this image of my mom because my dad would do the garden, like the big vegetable garden, and my mom would go out early in the morning to get those flowers, the yellow flowers that come out and they have to be open. And then she would pull them very gently. And you could see her with her apron and she still had her curlers on, right? And she'd have her little house coat and her apron and she'd be picking these yellow flowers in order to make this, well, as I said, we call them vecchiarelli. And we couldn't wait. And then when I was around 10 years old or so, she'd say, come so you could learn. And everything was by eye, right? All'occhio.
That's right.
Does anyone else want to share anything? Or I will keep moving along. Oh, Christina, go ahead.
I'll be brief because apparently the history of pancakes is ancient, but I figure I've never really thought so seriously about pancakes. I lived in Newfoundland and everyone ate them on Shrove Tuesday, but Nonna made them, and I don't know how she had made her own recipe. They were more crepe-like. I suspect possibly my mother taught her how, but she adapted them, and I think it was like her Canadian, like, or attempt at Canadian cooking, if you will. Although she always added like a huge dollop of olive oil to the batter. And I'm just I just started making a list, like my life in pancakes, and I'm like, oh, I've eaten many pancakes, like of different cultures and ethnicities and backgrounds. And I was like, oh yeah, sure, injera, that's a pancake, apparently, or considered to be a pancake in that it's a flat, round, bread-like thing. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's one of my favorites. So anyway, I'm rambling, but you have prompted in me this whole pancake kind of project now that I'm going to have to, yeah, figure out.
I think I have somewhere from a class that I taught a recipe for like medieval English pancakes. I'm going to send it to you.
That'd be great.
I think they were much less sweet than our pancakes now. So I made the students make them and they were like, they really weren't good.
Yeah, some of those medieval recipes are not what one would expect.
But thank you all so much for sharing. I'm gonna wrap up now, just so we have 5 minutes for some questions too. But what I wanted to bring just at the end is kind of a reflection. And sorry, my cat is in his mood to walk back and forth, so you will see him. But bringing it all together, of course, it all depends on the outcome of what you want to do. So I brought all these different aspects together in writing for the cookbook because, as I said, it's like a journey through the towns that participated. So every town had its info page, right, where it included the stories of the people from the towns and how they remember and connect to that town, but also some historical research that I was able to do, and then tying it back to the associations that were formed here wherever I could. And then in the recipes, because I was able to do that, in the recipe blurbs, I was able to connect a bit more with the individual stories wherever there was something particular to say. But of course, the challenge of this cookbook is that it's in Italian and English. So as short as a recipe blurb is, this had to be even shorter because there had to be space for English and Italian. So the challenges here for me were, editing, because obviously I had something much more robust in mind, having very clear, concise writing, and keeping a similar tone throughout all the different recipes, which is something to keep in mind, in a collection of recipes. You want to have a tone that runs throughout. Versus the other type of writing that I do, which is, my longer form writing on my newsletter, that allows me to explore the autobiographical, the historic, the community, the family behind all these different dishes and topics I want to explore. The difficulty or the challenge here is to make sure everything is balanced, right? You don't want it to be too much like I without the bigger picture of, what am I taking away from this? What is the story that it's telling about my community, about the history? And so that's much more challenging in a longer piece, right? Where it's kind of easier to go into the autobiographical than to actually do the research and write historically about it. So those are the two outcomes that I've worked with in terms of food writing. My activity I was going to talk about Harvey's, but you could ask me questions about it if you want. The activity that I will give you for homework before questions is exactly of bringing all these together. And you could do two things. One, write a blurb, like an introduction to the recipe for a cookbook, where it's going to be, 250 words, give or take, where you're going to balance these elements that you used of autobiography, personal communal history, folklore, in a way to get readers and people who will make the recipe to learn about the dish, but to also learn what it means to you so that they could connect to the food. And maybe Licha, after we could send the slides to everybody so that they have the questions. The optional homework is interview someone in your community or family about this recipe. That's, adding that other layer and allowing you to do kind of an extended version of this recipe blurb, including also that person's story. And I will send you my email in the chat, but also Licha, I'll have you send my email to them as well. If anyone wants to share with me, I will love to read what you write about these recipes. And Licha, since you gave me until 2:05, can we take until 2:06, 3 minutes for questions? Okay, so if anyone has any questions or comments, I'm glad to answer. I'm happy to answer them. Thank you, Anna. Anna Romano, since there's 3 Annas. No questions?
Can you go over Harvey's real quick?
I could go over Harvey's real quick. So this is a historic image of the Harveys that we used to go to as children with my nonna. And in researching Harvey's and like researching about my family history, I realized that the first Harvey's opened in Canada. Thank you, Marisa. The first Harvey's opened the same year that my family came to Montreal. And so I'm like, oh my God, it was meant to be. And so my nonna had never eaten fast food in her life at all, right? You don't eat fast food in Cantalupo nel Sagno, Molise. And she fell in love with Harvey's in her 30s. And it was interesting to kind of see the spread of Harvey's also coincided with like the growth of the family business, which was a butcher on Jean Talon Street here in Montreal. And so when she was 30, my nonna went to this Harvey's for the first time and had a hot dog, which she had never eaten. And she fell in love with the grilled, Harvey's hot dogs are like the big grilled hot dogs. It's not like the steamies that we have. And every month after that, she would go with her friends to eat at Harvey's once a month. When she got older and her friends didn't go anymore, she would drag. Now I realize, because I asked her, why do you love Harvey's? Like, why did you always bring us to Harvey's? I realized that she replaced her friends with my sister and I when we were in elementary school. And that's why we would go to Harvey's once a month at lunch. And so it became kind of this like family tradition where we ate at Harvey's once a month with my nonna. And I always find it interesting because, Italians are we have the reputation of being food snobs. But part of our tradition, our Italian Montreal tradition, was eating at this Harvey's, which unfortunately in the 2010s was demolished. So it doesn't exist anymore, our Harvey's that we used to go to. Just the memories. Thank you, Maria. And I mean, if there's no other question, I wanted to add one thing that I think is really important in terms of like community projects, is that community collaboration is often glamorized by public historians, by people in academia of like, look at this fun, amazing thing that we did with community. But community collaboration is also very hard. And like, it's sometimes a struggle to get through what you want to get through when you have to work with so many different people. And so I want, I don't want to glamorize this project either. It is hard work to do community work, and there's so much, what's the word that I'm looking for? Compromise and, discussion and change of ideas that needs to happen, which is not always easy when you have a creative vision, but it's all part of it, right? And so that's part of doing this community work too, is navigating human beings and people and building community in that way, accepting that you're gonna have to compromise. Thank you so much. I'm reading all the comments. Was there a hand up? Sorry. Oh, if someone wants to say something, Marie, go ahead. You could go ahead and say. I don't know if it's it. Oh, there we go.
So had trouble. So Cassandra, about your nonna liking Harvey's, do you think it's because like Harvey's is kind of her baby? Like she watched it
She
blossom.
watched it grow as she came. I have to ask her that, but I think for her it was like the first fast food she ever had. And so like Italians also have this loyalty thing with food where it's like in any nana's cupboard, if you need baking powder, it's magic baking powder. There's no other baking powder that is accepted in your house. Like that's just the only one. I didn't realize there were other brands of baking powder growing up. And so I feel like that is a part of it too. It's just like this loyalty that she created to Harvey's. And exactly, it was growing as she got here. So she would have seen it kind of pop up around her, this new place of this, this new food that she never tried. And interestingly enough, whenever fast food comes up in the family, McDonald's is always at the bottom of the list for the older generations. Like they'll like KFC, like Harvey's, but everyone hates McDonald's. And I think it might also be because Harvey's felt more local than McDonald's. So yeah.
All right, thanks.
Thank you for the question. So I think, Leach, I don't know if you had your little conclusion to.
Yes, I do. Thank you very much, Cassandra. It was a lot of fun. Really great. And thank you all for participating today. I'd like to invite you to the next workshop on September 6th. I've put it in the chat. Workshop 6, Writing About Wine and Other Brews with Julia de Gasperi. And you can check out all the other workshops coming up at accenti.ca. Workshops to build community. Thank you all for being here today. Accenti's project, Workshops to Build Community, is made possible through the Social Development Canada as part of the New Horizons Seniors Program. We look forward to seeing you on September 6th, or, we have workshops every month until Christmas time. So see you soon again. Enjoy the rest of the day, and hope to see you in person sometime.